Well, hello, hello. It's finally winter here in Vancouver. Would you like to see what's in this little bag that I made? Let me show you. It's this. And this has been my obsession for the last 2 months. Let me unroll it and show you what's inside. Well, it all started when I was asked to teach a class on botanical embroidery, and I thought I should make a sample. And then I got carried away. I had this large bag of little scraps of fabric, and I intended for the scroll just to have plants in it. And then I pulled out one of the scraps of fabric, and it told me that it was a cottage. So a cottage came in, and then another cottage, and then a bird, and then all bets were off. There were all kinds of non-plant materials in my scroll. And the ideas just kept coming to me. And it just kept going. And I told myself the one thing I was not going to put in was any fences. And then this section just needed a fence. And I tell you, I could not stop. The ideas just kept tumbling out of my head. And then more human interventions came in. And it's rare that, for me in any case, that the ideas that I have in my head translate so beautifully onto the page. And I tell you, I am in love with this. I just can't stop. It's just turned out so well. And as you can see, I'm not quite finished yet. I've got a little bit left to go. And it occurred to me that the 2-hour workshop that I'm teaching, those little bits that are attached there, they are bits that I'm auditioning, things that I thought were fun and that I thought I might like to use, but I'm not quite sure where they're going to go. And this piece has taken me so very many hours, and I cannot possibly teach people how to do all of this in a 2-hour workshop, especially if they're absolute beginners. So I thought I'd make a series of videos that people could watch after the workshops, and I decided that I wanted to end this piece the same way that I started. And I had a little bit of the cloth that I'd started out with for the ground when I started, and I'm going to attach that piece at the end, and this will be the perfect place to demonstrate the few very simple stitches really that I used to create this whole thing. So let's get started, shall we? And I use the most simple of materials. I just have this simple, humble piece of muslin, and I use primarily the 6-strand embroidery thread. And the brand that I have here, the one with the label on it, is Anchor. I tend to use DMC and Anchor quite a lot because they're quite readily available. I often buy it at the secondhand store. And it comes in 6 strands, and you don't have to use all 6 strands. I use usually 2, sometimes 1, sometimes 3. And what kind of needle do I use? I don't know, whatever I have. I have lots of needles, and they are not particularly, well, they're not labeled at all. I prefer the ones that have the big eye but are not too thick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the very beginning, assuming nothing. So I'm going to show you how I do everything, and I'll even show you how I start off the thread. I learned that you don't tie knots in the end of your string, and that's something that I do automatically without even thinking about it. So to get started, what I do is I take a few small stitches in and out of the cloth. I leave a small tail, and then I take another stitch just the same way right over the same space. And I do that 2 or 3 times until the cloth is really secured. And so you can see here the way that I start off my thread. There isn't a lump or a knot on the back. In this project, it does not matter. If you want to tie a knot, you absolutely can tie a knot. And let me show you how to tie a knot. So I'm going to do this with a big plastic needle that I'm not going to use. This is just for demonstrating. And some knitting yarn so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit more easily. So this is what I would do, but with my sewing thread. So I make a loop, and then I stick the end of my thread through that little circle twice. I wrap it around twice, and then I pull, and that's called a double wrapped overhand knot, and it makes a biggish knot that lightly won't pull through your cloth. Oh, and let me show you another way to tie a knot. So what you do is you wrap the end of your thread around your needle. You have to make sure that you're wrapping it up the needle from the pointy end towards the eye or the hole, and not in the other way around. Wrap it from the bottom to the top, and then hold on to those wraps and pull through the needle, pull it all the way through the thread, and where it stops there will be a knot. And if you want to practice this way of making a knot, this will be good practice for a stitch that I'm going to show you later. And I'm starting with running stitch. And running stitch is a really simple stitch. It's also a really useful stitch, and it can be very decorative. So I'm attaching the green cloth onto the white cloth. But if you are brand new to this, I would not recommend trying to attach two pieces of cloth together. I would just running stitch just on a plain piece of cloth. If you're just sewing on one layer of cloth, just bring your needle and your thread up to the front and then start making a stitch. I don't go to the back, pull the needle through, and then come up to the front and pull the needle and the thread all the way through. I rock my needle back and forward into the cloth and then back out again, and take one stitch if you're just starting out, and then pull the thread through. So I'm only working on the front layer of the cloth. Once you've practiced that a little bit, you can start loading on more stitches onto your cloth. How many stitches? I don't know. Depends on the length of your needle and how strong your hands are to pull it out. Some people in some styles of knitting will load on as many stitches as they want. I usually do 2 or 3. And many of these little bits of cloth here were attached using this running stitch. And you can use it temporarily. It's called a basting stitch. For this particular project, I did not take out any of my stitches. I just left them as they were. And then once you've got some stitches built up, if you flip it over to the back, you'll notice that the back looks the same as the front. And you've got this sort of dashed or broken line of stitches. And so now that you've had some practice with your stitch, let me show you how to use the running stitch to make a stem of a plant. So I moved my needle up to the space where I want my stem to be, and I haven't gone too terribly far. I don't want a big float at the back of my cloth. So if you have a really big float, it can kind of get caught up on things. Plants grow up towards the sky, so my running stitches are going in that direction. And you'll notice this does not look at all like a stem. It's got all those gaps in it. I'm going to show you how to change this into a stem by embellishing the running stitch and make it something called whipped running stitch, which will fill in all of those gaps. So basically you take your needle, and this is easiest if you use the top end with the hole in it, the non-sharp end of your needle, and you're just going to thread it back through each of the stitches you made. You're not going through to the back of the cloth until you get to the bottom. You're just threading the needle through the stitches on the top layer. I'll do it again here. You'll see what I mean. And as I move the threads over, I'm not worrying about the back, but I'm just making sure that the thread on the back is not too loose and not too tight, that it's not pulling the cloth to make it pucker up, but there isn't a big loose loop on the back. And here I'm going again, and this time you'll notice that this line of stitches is a little bit wonky, and that's quite all right. That's kind of the way nature grows. And as you can see, there are probably some things that you've noticed. I don't have any markings on my cloth. I'm doing this quite intuitively, and I'm just letting things appear where they may. I'm not really worrying about it being exact because nature isn't precise, and I don't want things to be lined up in little rows or looking like really stiff plastic molded flowers or plants. I want them to look really organic and natural, and that happens without planning. Nature does not plan where it's going to grow, it just happens. Now I want to show you another stitch. This stitch is called a straight stitch. Now, Many of these basic stitches come in a continuous version where you just keep sewing like we did in our running stitch in a straight line, and what's called a detached version. So this straight stitch is just like an individual stitch, and then the next one doesn't really carry on. It just kind of moves somewhere else randomly on your cloth. And now as I've been working on my scroll here, whenever I have a bit of thread left over when I finish the section, I find a place to use it rather than saving it for later or wasting it. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm adding some straight stitches. I don't have a lot left, but I'm adding a few straight stitches near the bottom of my cloth. And it does two things. It helps to secure that green cloth to the base fabric, but it also adds a decorative element, and those can be little tufts of grass or little short plants that are starting to grow up. And I use the stitch in other ways as well. I've made little spiky flower petals. I've used it to attach some of the trees, parts of the trees down, the round bits of trees, but also the long skinny evergreen trees. And now I'm going to show you how I did that. So as you can see here, I've got quite a bundle of greenish fabrics, and I'm going to look for one that I think will show up nicely against the background cloth that I have. And I'm just auditioning, trying out a bunch of different cloths until I found one that I like. I like that round one, but I kind of like it as a circle, so I don't really want to cut it out at this point. But let's see, this blue, maybe? I don't know. I think I'm going to use this one, but I think that I like the darker part of it to be at the bottom. So I'm going to cut that piece off, and then I'm going to cut a long narrow triangle. No template. I'm just going to cut a triangle that has a flat base and two long narrow sides. And then I'm going to use straight stitches to sew it down onto the cloth, and those will look like little branches on the tree. And I'm going to start that tree. I'm not going to put it right on the edge of the green fabric. I'm going to overlap it with the green fabric, and that's really how things sit on the horizon line. If you look at things, they don't sit right at the horizon line, which is what the top edge of that green fabric is in art terms. It's the horizon line. They sit situated down into the ground, just like the stems that I made don't start at the horizon line either. They start a little bit lower down. So now I'm going to start my straight stitches through all the layers here, and that will secure the tree down. And now these are really small pieces of fabric, and I don't tend to use pins to hold them down. It's just a personal preference. I find pins really fiddly. The thread always gets wrapped around them, and I always end up poking myself, so I find it easier and less awkward to just hold the piece of cloth down. So I'm just going back and forth without really much of a plan, just stitching here and there in all directions. Some of them are going out beyond the edge of the cloth. Now, one of the things that I do make a point off, I've got that tall, narrow, pointy bit at the top, so I'm going to make sure that that gets secured down. I'll take a stitch just above it and then stitch back well into the cloth, because if I go too close to the edge, the cloth might start to come unravels. And I'll keep going until I don't have any more thread left on my needle. And I'm just taking a few stitches on the back to secure the thread. And in between, when I'm not using the needle, I'm going to secure it onto the cloth so I know where it is and it's not going to roll off onto the floor. So I want to make another tree, and I'm auditioning a few more fabrics, and I'm looking for one that's going to show up nicely against my first tree and the ground, and I'm going to overlap this tree with the other tree so it looks like it's in front of the other tree, and it's not going to be hanging up in the air, dangling in the air. And the bottom of this one, because it's in front of the other tree, is going to actually be lower down on the horizon, lower down on the ground. That will give the viewer a clue that it is in front of the other tree, that they're not sitting side by side, and that's something And now I've stitched down that second tree just the same way as I did the first one. And I've also added a little blob on the side there. And as you can see, it looks like it's floating, and when I add the trunk, it'll attach itself to the ground. It'll become grounded. Now, already made those spiky flowers there, but I think that they don't look substantial enough, so I want to make them bigger. And I'm going to do something a little different this time. Instead of using two strands of thread that are the same color, I'm going to use two strands of threads, but they're going to be two different colors. So I've already cut out lengths of my six-stranded floss, an orange and a yellow, and I've made them both the same length, and I'm pulling out one strand of each of those. And I'm going to work with this, and it'll give it a nice blended effect. And I'm securing my thread on the back again, and I'm going to take longer straight stitches here that all kind of emanate from the same place, and this will give it the appearance of spiky little flowers. And this sort of blended effect where I'm using the two different colors, I find it tends to work best if the two different colors are quite different from each other. They're very similar, like a pink and a peach. They tend to not really, it doesn't tend to look much different than using two strands of the same color. But if they're quite different, if they look different, quite different when you look at them, it gives a little bit more impact and creates a really nice effect. And there you go. There, I've got two little flowers there. I'm going to secure that thread at the back again. And I've got a little bit left still. Probably not enough to worry about, but I think I can make a few stitches with this little bit. So I'm going to add a few more stitches to the ground there. They can read as fallen leaves from a tree, or perhaps just other bits of plant material that are lying on the ground there. And again, just back and forth. Yeah, and I really don't have enough to make it worthwhile worrying about, but yeah, I like to squeeze every last stitch that I can out of my thread. It is a lot easier if you stop before you get to the very end to secure your thread at the back, but yeah, I try to make as many stitches as I can before moving on, and I often will bounce back and forth to other places and look at other parts of my scroll to see if there's another area that I can use this thread in to do something else, and that way I develop lots and lots of texture. And there you go. There are the first two stitches for you, actually 3 stitches. In the next video I'll introduce 2 more stitches. Actually, they're 2 sides of the same stitch. They're called back stitch and stem stitch, and you'll see what I mean by 2 sides of the same stitch. So thanks for watching this far, and I will see you again in the next video.